So today's video is going to be part 2 of the Anatoly Moskvin House of Dolls case. That's right, this is a part 2 of a 2-part series, so if you didn't catch part 1, I'll leave it linked up here in the eye. You kind of need to watch that one before you watch this one because it won't make much sense. You need to know all the background and things, so I will wait here patiently for you to go and watch the first part, and then you can come back to this tab and then come and watch this. But if we're all caught up on part 1, then let's jump right into the second part. Now, before we get into this one, I just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible. Honey. Now that we're in lockdown again, and it doesn't look like the world is gonna go back to normal anytime soon, online shopping is pretty much the only shopping we can do at the moment. And Honey is perfect for saving you money while you're doing all your online shopping. Honey is a free browser extension that searches the internet for different promo codes and tests them all for you at checkout to try and save you a little bit of money. Honey has been an essential of mine for literally years now. Thank you, David Dobrik. It's super easy to set up. You can download it in literally just 2 clicks. And then after that, when you're online shopping on over 30,000 different sites, you'll get this little pop-up of Honey asking if you want to find a code. Just click apply coupons and then wait for Honey to test all of its different codes and you can save some money, literally by doing nothing. It works on so many different sites: clothing, beauty, tech, gaming, even food deliveries. Since it was my birthday last week, I wanted to treat myself to some things off of my Urban Outfitters wish list. I've had some of these on there for so long and I thought I'm gonna use Honey to get some money off of them, and look how much I saved. I'm in love with Honey. So if you want to download Honey, you can go to joinhoney.com/Eleanor. If you have a computer, Honey should be on it. You can't risk missing so many discounts when you're online shopping. That's joinhoney.com/Eleanor. You need to put that on the end so that they know that little Eleanor Neale sent you over. Let's all start saving some money. Thanks again to Honey for sponsoring this video. I love you guys. Now I'm just going to give you a quick little summary of part 1 just to jog your memory, and then we're just going to jump straight into part 2. So Anatoly Moskvin was a 45-year-old Russian academic genius known for writing and translating many books between Russian and other languages. He'd had a number of career pursuits in his life. He was a very intelligent man that mastered a lot of things in his lifetime. He was a lecturer, professor, author, everything. But most notably in this case, something that he enjoyed a lot was his work in cemeteries. He had a job for about a year where he went touring around Russia, analysing and researching all these different cemeteries, and he would literally sleep in the cemeteries overnight so that he wouldn't have to go home. He literally lived in graveyards for a full year working on them. And the way that he got this interest and this obsession with death and the afterlife and cemeteries, it actually stems back to his childhood. When he was around 12 years old, he experienced a rather traumatic event. He found himself attending the funeral of an 11-year-old girl that he didn't know, and when he was there, he was forced to kiss her 3 times, and then he was married to her. Essentially, her mother just put a ring on his finger and a ring on her dead daughter's finger and said, you two are now married. But I mean, they weren't, but 12-year-old Moskvin obviously thought that they were. And ever since that point, this must have really affected him because he began having recurring nightmares where this girl, his dead wife, would visit him in his dreams every single night, trying to make him perform black magic. He eventually got rid of this girl, but that obsession with the darker things in life and black magic and the occult, and he joined a Luciferian group in university. It all stuck with him for the rest of his life. As he got older, he fell into a romantic relationship with a woman, although due to his celibacy, he couldn't have a child with this woman, but he really wanted one. They tried to adopt a child, but the adoption agency said no because they didn't have enough money. They weren't married. He ended up splitting up from this woman, and he always just felt like something was missing in his life because of this. You know, he wanted a child, specifically a daughter. He got his hopes up around the adoption, and those hopes were broken for him, and he knew that he couldn't have a child because he refused to have sex, and he knew that he couldn't adopt because he didn't have the money. So he always felt like this part of him was missing. As I said, he was a writer, he was an author, and in these books, he shared a lot of his very unsavory and horrific views. He was a fascist, he was a Nazi, he was a horrible piece of work, really. And so in 2011, when a string of anti-Muslim grave desecrations were taking place, a lot of Muslim graves were being vandalised and dug up and things like that, police looked straight at Anatoly Moskvin because he was a grave expert. He did work literally in cemeteries and they knew he had all these awful views, so put two and two together. It was probably him, so they went to his house to go and arrest him and search for any evidence that this was him, but they actually found something completely different than what they were expecting to find. They walked in to see 26 human-sized dolls scattered around his whole apartment. Some of them sat on the sofa as if they actually lived there, some of them were up on shelves, and they were very creepy looking as well. A lot of them had like wax faces. They were definitely homemade. These were not very well done. And when the police moved these dolls around the apartment to try and search for any evidence relating to the grave desecrations, they would move these dolls and some of them would rattle, some of them would even play music out of them, and at one point one of these dolls made a rattling noise and the police all looked at each other and thought, we need to open this because this might be evidence that this man is trying to hide inside one of his dolls. So police decided to try and cut open this particular doll, and when they did, they didn't find documents, they didn't find evidence. They actually found something entirely different and so much more horrifying. Inside this life-size doll were the human remains of a teenage girl. She'd been mummified and dressed up like a doll and then kept on display in Moskvin's apartment. This was a dead body in his house that was made to look like a doll, like a life-size doll. Now this meant that police had to seize this search immediately and get all of these dolls to the lab, because if one of them had human remains inside of them, does that mean that the other 25 scattered around his apartment also had human remains in them? So all of these dolls were taken to the lab, they were cut open, and inside every single one was a different human body. 26 whole human bodies inside these dolls. They were all female. They were ranging in ages between 3 and I think 12 years old. So they were all children, and a lot of them actually had a big open wound in their chest that had been dug out and replaced with a music box or a voice box or, you know, something to make a noise so that when the doll moved, they would talk or they would sing. They were all real life human dolls. So pathologists identified as many of these girls as they possibly could. A lot of them were very hard to identify due to how their body was changed after their death. You know, they were completely mummified. But anyway, the ones that could be identified, their families were informed that their bodies had been found. And a lot of these families were actually very confused and very surprised to find that out, because they claimed that their loved one was already dead and already buried. They'd buried their loved one, so how were police now finding their body in some guy's apartment? Now it turned out that all of these girls' bodies that Anatoly Moskvin had mummified, turned into dolls and then put on display, were dead bodies that he had dug out of the graveyard, out of their graves, taken out of their coffins and taken for himself. Taken them back home. Inside their bodies, their autopsies found a lot of their personal belongings that the girls had been buried with, so say like rings or anything like that, had been stuffed inside of their bodies. For whatever reason this was, we have no idea, but they were now inside of the girls. He would then stuff their bodies with rags and other kind of materials, just kind of padding, stuffing, to fill them out a little bit more, because they were decaying, they were decomposing, they were shriveling up, they were no longer kind of human shaped, they weren't full like a normal human body is. So they were stuffed, they were covered in a mixture of salt and baking soda to dry them out, and this would help to preserve the bodies to the best of Moskvin's ability. This stage was actually the longest of the whole process, because he would actually have to wait a few days. After putting the salt and baking soda on, he would have to wait for it to dry up, he would have to put more on, wait for it to dry up for a few days. He had to do this maybe about 4 times. This took maybe about 2 weeks to do, this stage of the process. And when the bodies were completely dried out, he would then move on to the bandaging process. He would wrap these bodies in a hell load of rags and bandages to keep the shape, and then he would stuff their legs covered in these bandages into tights just to kind of keep it all together. Now, all of this part of the process, up to this point, you know, getting them out of the coffin and then cutting them open to put a noise box in and then padding out their body and then drying them out and then covering them in rags, dressing them, all of this took place in the graveyard. He wouldn't actually take them home by this point. He would keep them in the graveyard. I'll explain a little bit more later on how he would exactly do that, but for now I'm just going to carry on talking about the process. So yeah, he would wrap the body in multiple layers of material and bandage. They would look like a mummy. And finally, the last stage was that he would put a doll face on them. Sometimes he would try to cut one off an actual doll so that they actually just looked like a doll, and sometimes he would have to make his own wax mask for them. Now these obviously looked a lot less realistic, so then he would go into local trash cans and any kind of rubbish pile that he could find and see if he could find any women's clothes, makeup, nail varnish, anything to decorate these dolls with, and then he would take them back home and paint on lipstick, paint on eyes, everything like that. Now sometimes with these wax masks, they wouldn't look very realistic, and he wanted to try and make them look as realistic as he possibly could, so he would stick on some eyes, something that could stand in for eyes anyway. Whether that was, you know, fake little googly eyes from actual dolls, or whether it was like buttons or anything circular that could act as eyes. And he said that he did this so that he could bring the dolls out and they could watch cartoons with him. Now, Moskvin doesn't actually see anything wrong with what he was doing here. He thinks that this was a form of art. He thinks that he was doing a good thing to these girls' bodies so that they weren't, you know, stuck underground. He doesn't see it as desecrating the girls' bodies or pulling them from their place of rest. He was quoted saying that he was careful, affectionate, gentle, and polite with his process. He said that he never disfigured or damaged the bodies, and he has actually commended himself for not swearing in front of the dolls. As if that's something to applaud him for. After he's taken these little girls from their place of rest and literally mutilated their human bodies, their dead bodies, and now he's not swearing in front of them, so he should be commended for that. He thinks that he was a good owner to these dolls. That's what he's trying to say. Now, despite the mummification and the wrapping and the drying out of these bodies, you know, he still wasn't an expert in mummification. He wasn't preserving the bodies entirely. And so there was still this awful stench of decomposition because the bodies were still decaying. They weren't preserved fully. And as the number of dolls grew, the strength of this smell grew and grew, until eventually all of the neighbours on Moskvin's street were complaining of this smell coming from his house, and they all put it down to a bad sewage problem. They didn't actually try and look into what was making that smell. I don't suppose anyone really would. You wouldn't just assume that your neighbour was keeping dead bodies around their house. Now, this discovery of all of these girls' bodies in Moskvin's apartment did kind of make sense to police. This wasn't a complete shock, don't get me wrong, it was a huge shock still, but they were looking for a bunch of girls' bodies from the graveyard. In the years running up to this discovery, they had received a few different reports of different young girls' graves looking tampered with. It's the kind of thing that they struggled to investigate, and so nothing really came of it. A lot of parents would go to the graveyard and notice that things were moved on their child's grave, or that things were put there when they didn't put them there, things were taken when they didn't take them away. Some families reported that the soil by their loved one's grave appeared fresh, as if it had kind of been dug up and replanted down. But Moskvin says that he had dug up some of these bodies and then repressed the soil so well that you would have never been able to tell that he was there. And this is what I mean when some of the families were so confused at how their daughter's body had ended up in Moskvin's apartment, because they had no idea that their graves had been dug up, because they didn't look dug up. They didn't even know that their daughter's body was missing. They didn't know that their grave was empty for the last few years, that they had been going and mourning and grieving and praying over an empty grave. Meanwhile, their daughter was dressed up as a doll in some man's apartment. Along with these dolls, police also found a load of pictures of different gravestones in Moskvin's apartment. I believe these were pictures of the girls' graves that he'd made dolls out of so that he could keep track of things like names, birthdays, death dates, any kind of information about these girls. He also had a bunch of different maps of different grave sites, different cemeteries, ways to get there. He even actually had some physical chunks of headstones and plaques off graves and anything that he could get. And they also found a step-by-step manual on how to mummify someone. As soon as these dolls were found, Anatoly Moskvin was front page news all over Russia. All of the headlines dubbing him the puppeteer or the Lord of the Mummies. And now everyone was talking about him. And all of this was taking a huge toll on Anatoly Moskvin's parents. They claim that neither of them had any idea what was going on with his son. They lived with him in this apartment. They literally lived in the same four walls as these 26 human corpse dolls that, by the way, had a putrid smell coming from them because they were literally decaying. But somehow they claim they had no idea that any of this was going on, and all of this was just a huge shock for them to find out that their son had been doing this and keeping these dead bodies in their apartment for so long. They'd been living with them. They said that they just assumed that this was a DIY decor project that their son had been working on, and he just liked making dolls. But they had no idea that they actually had human bodies in them. You know, Moskvin was actually known back in his youth to collect dolls. Before he went off to university, he had quite a collection, so his parents thought he was just kind of falling back into that hobby. It was clearly a lot deeper than they actually thought. And his parents say that they both got rather ill around the time that all of this came out and they found this out, citing both stress and shock from finding out that this had been going on, from finding out that their son was this person that they had no idea he was. His mother was hospitalized, his father had a heart attack, and they both pinpoint all the stress and the shock as the reasons for their illness. Now, for the most part, Moskvin had kept the dolls either in his own bedroom, in the living room, in any kind of storage room, or of course in the garage. However, there was one doll that he kept in his parents' bedroom, and it stood right at the end of their bed. Now, his parents do say that they worried a little bit about their son's new obsession with these dolls, you know, not because they thought there was anything sinister going on, but because he started talking to these dolls and acting like they were real humans. They thought that he might have been going a little bit insane in the house, because I said he was a recluse. He didn't go out, he didn't socialize with anyone, and so they thought he was, you know, this was taking a mental toll on him, and he started talking to these dolls. His mother remarked that Moskvin became very childlike, and he would refuse to have dinner unless his dolls were sat at the table, and if a family member came over, he would introduce his doll to the family member as if it was another person sat at the table. And these are things that you see children doing with their doll. You know, they want to introduce everyone to their doll, and it's cute. But with a 40-something-year-old man, personally, I think it's pretty hard to believe that there were 26 rotting corpses in this family's home and the parents just had no idea. I think a lot of this is just covering for their son, not gonna lie. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Anatoly Moskvin confessed to absolutely everything, because he didn't actually see an issue with what he'd done. Robbing these children's bodies out of their graves, out of their place of rest, taking them home, mummifying these children, mutilating them, adding in a noise box into their human body, basically, he didn't see anything wrong with all of this, and his motive for doing what he did, he said, was loneliness. He was so lonely without a companion, without a wife, without a girlfriend, without a child. He so badly wanted a child, but the adoption agency declined his application because he wasn't earning enough money. He didn't have a very stable life to be able to introduce a child into. He said that he felt sorry for these children that he grave robbed, not because he grave robbed them, but because they died so young. He felt sorry for them having such a short life, and he just wanted to be friends with them. He just wanted to have them as his children, which is why he would mainly go for young girls, not because this was some weird sexual thing. I mean, of course there's a potential element of that. That's never been proven, and a lot of people don't actually think that in this case, but you know, there's always the possibility. But a lot of people think it's because he was trying to have a daughter, or at least something to call a daughter and treat like a daughter. And then in his questioning, he changed his motive. So at first it was because he was lonely and because he felt sorry for these kids. But now he changed his motive, saying that it was because he wanted to perform black magic on them and bring them back to life. Which again goes back to the fact that he feels sorry for them. He felt sorry for them that they only had such a short life, and he thought that one day maybe science or black magic would progress to the point where he would be able to perform some kind of ritual or spell and these girls would come back to life. And he actually praised himself for getting to some of these girls just in time so that their bodies weren't too decomposed, that maybe they would be able to be brought back to life. And I mean, he really did treat these poor girls like his daughters. He would refer to them as his girls. He'd interact with them every single day, groom them. He would talk to them in a made-up language. They would sing together. Of course, they can't sing. But he said that he would have conversations with them. How? I don't know. He even kept track of each of these girls' birthdays. Like I said, he would take a picture of their gravestone so that he could remember things like this. And every single year, when each of their birthdays would come round, they would celebrate. They would get, you know, party hats and presents and decorations, and there would be birthday celebrations for these dolls. He would bring them all together in the same room for the holidays and for tea parties. Other than that, they were kept all kind of separate all over the house. But he liked to have certain times where they would all come together and they would all celebrate. And he also went one step further than just celebrating with the dolls, but he would also write letters to each of these girls when a certain milestone would potentially happen in their life. You know, they reach a birthday or it's New Year. He would write them a letter, and instead of giving it to the doll, he would go to the girl's grave and leave this letter at her grave. Now, a lot of the time, these girls' families would go and visit their graves on New Year's Day, and they would find a letter addressed to their dead child from someone they have no idea who it is. Moskvin would also go through the neighbours' trash, like I said, to go and find different clothes for them and makeup and nail varnish. He never wanted them to not feel beautiful. He always wanted to change their appearance for them, make them feel nice. He explained to the police that there was actually a hierarchy of his girls. There were some of them that he liked the most, so they were the ones that he would keep like in his bedroom, and the ones that he liked the least he would keep in the garage so he wouldn't have to see them. He never let his parents into this world that he called it. They had their own world. Did him and all of his girls. His parents would go away for the summer every year from April to August, and so from that time it was just him and his girls in the apartment, and he could do whatever he wanted. He could talk to them, they could celebrate, he could sit them on the sofa and make them watch cartoons with him. He would do things with them as if they were real life children. So he would sing nursery rhymes to them, play games with them, they would watch kids' TV together. He said that he would even offer them food. Okay, so I just feel like this video is just going up a level, up a level, up a level. Now, Moskvin actually said that every single body that he dug up, every single doll that he made, he actually had permission from the girls themselves to do so, to dig them up out of their graves. They actually wanted him to. He said that he would communicate with these girls' ghosts before he would dig them out of their graves. And to do so, he would have to sleep on top of their graves. And in their dreams, they would come to him and they would beg him to free them. They would tell him how much they didn't want to be dead, how much they didn't want to be buried, and that they wanted to be dug out and freed. He claimed that he didn't dig up any bodies that he didn't communicate with and get permission to do so from the girl first. So the first body that Moskvin dug up was on May 9th, 2003, which, just think about this for a minute, he was arrested in 2011. The first body that he dug up was 2003. That's almost 9 years that this poor girl's body was in his home for. 9 whole years that he was living this life and doing this, and no one had any idea. 9 years that this girl's family were grieving over her empty grave. He actually did his first one after an argument with his parents. He just stormed off and went to the graveyard and did it. Now, you might think that sounds very spur of the moment, but trust me, it wasn't. He'd prepared to do this for some time. He'd been researching how to do this for a very, very long time, and I think it was just this argument that was actually about the adoption. He wanted to adopt a child, they didn't want him to adopt a child, and I think it was that just spurred him to be like, okay, today's the day, I'm gonna do it. But up until this point, he'd actually been travelling around city to city, going to so many different libraries, finding all the books, all the information that he could on mummification, because he wanted to do it well. So anyway, he had this argument with his parents where they wouldn't let him adopt a child, and so Moskvin decided that he was gonna go out and get a child another way. So he walked to the graveyard after dark and found the grave of a young girl, and he decided that one was going to be it, and he dug and dug and dug until he reached a coffin under the ground. He then grabbed a chisel that he'd brought along and he physically forced his way into this coffin. He cut a hole in the head of the coffin. He ripped through the red silk that lined it, and then he reached in, grabbed this girl by the head, and then pulled her up through this hole in the coffin and put her out up on the side. Now, he said that the first one, this first body that he dug up, was in a pretty bad way. He actually said that he felt like he got to her just in time. This girl had long hair, she was wearing a white blouse, black skirt, black tights, black shoes. Now, not many of these dolls that Moskvin had and kept have been publicly identified, so I don't know a lot of the girls' names and things like that. However, with this first one, her parents have been quite vocal with the media about this case. So I was able to find a little bit of information about this one, so I'll give you some background information. Her name was Olga Chardimova and she was 10 years old. And Olga's cause of death was actually murder, whereas a lot of the other girls had kind of natural causes of death. Not necessarily natural, but you know, like accidents or disease or, you know, something like that. But this one was murder. And the murderer wasn't Moskvin. So Olga passed away in 2002. She just turned 10 years old, and she would often go to her grandmother's house, who only lived a couple of streets away in a different apartment building. Her parents would normally walk her to her grandma's house. However, she was 10 years old now, and she was begging them to let her go by herself. She wanted that little bit of freedom. She knew her way there, and she was saying, I'm 10 already, just let me go. And so her parents let her. This was the first time she'd ever done this walk by herself. She was so excited for this little bit of freedom. She got dressed with her favourite green bag, her blue umbrella. She said goodbye to her parents and she left. But Olga didn't even make it out of her own apartment building. She was actually stopped by a man on the way down to the lobby, and this man was on a lot of drugs. He was later found to be an addict. He stopped her, abducted her, grabbed her, and took her up to the top floor of the building, up onto the roof. Up there, he robbed what little Olga actually had on her. She was 10 years old. She wasn't going to have money or a phone or anything like that. So this man took her earrings, which we don't even know if they were worth anything. And it was at this point that Olga got scared and tried to escape. And as she did, he caught her, dragged her back, grabbed a heavy lead pipe and hit her over the head with it. and killed her instantly. And Olga was actually an unsolved disappearance case for almost half a year after this. Everyone was looking for this little 10-year-old girl everywhere, thinking that she'd gone missing on the walk to her grandma's house. So everyone's thinking that maybe a man's picked her up and taken her away. No one knew that the whole time her body was wedged behind some pipes on the roof of her own apartment building. She wasn't found until a maintenance man came along half a year later and went to go look in those pipes, and behind them he saw Olga. So like I said, Olga was killed in late 2002 and Moskvin dug up her body in early-ish 2003. So she wasn't even buried for half a year yet. Anyway, once he'd pulled her body out of this coffin, he took her over to a more shaded part of the cemetery. So in case anyone walked in, they wouldn't have seen what was going on. There he dug another shallow hole and buried her again, just in the mud this time. She wasn't in a coffin, she wasn't in anything, she was just in the mud. And that was where he was going to keep her for the time being. That was literally just to cover her up so no one could see her. And then he returned to her grave and reburied the coffin, put all of the soil back in, repatted it so it looked set, and then he left. He came back the next night with a mixture of salt and baking soda, and he poured it all over Olga's body after digging her out of this very shallow grave he made for her. Once he'd finished pouring this all over her body, he then reburied her in that shallow grave, and he would return every week to do this to her for a few weeks until he was sure that her body was dried out enough that he could go on to the next step of the process. And then when she was finally dried out enough, he decided that it was time to mummify her. He padded her body, he wrapped her up in bandages, and then he went and found some clothes out of a trash can to dress her in. He then made her a mask. He painted this mask with nail polishes, and then his first doll was finished and he took her home. Now, Olga was one of his favourites of his dolls, and he would often take her presents and write her letters and leave these on her gravestone. Every New Year, her family would return to her gravestone to go and visit their daughter, and there they would find a note written to Olga saying some very specific things about her that really freaked out the parents. And these letters were all signed from Kind Angel. And like I said, this was very specific stuff. Like, Moskvin would keep track of what school year Olga was about to go into, as if she was still alive, and he would write in the letters things like, "Happy last month of your 6th year at school," which is so creepy. Imagine being her parents and arriving at her grave to find these weird letters from someone about your daughter that you have no idea who is leaving this, and they're so specific like that. One day, Olga's parents even arrived at her grave and her headstone had been smashed. They looked to the side and a note had been left once again. They opened it and it said, "If you don't erect a great monument which she deserves, we will dig her body out." So there's much to unpack here. First of all, noticing that he is referring to himself as we. Is he possibly meaning we as in me and the other dolls? Who is we? Or is he just trying to make himself sound more intimidating? Or does he mean like him and his whole religion, cult, whatever he was part of? So Olga's parents were left terrified that now their daughter's grave was being smashed up like this. They were terrified, and so they paid for a bigger and better gravestone, and they hoped that this might make this person leave them alone, leave their daughter's grave alone. They even put a fence around her grave to try to stop the tampering, but even this didn't work. One day, as they were still putting this fence up, they arrived to come and paint it, and they found that a wreath that they'd put on the fence had actually been moved. So someone was still coming to Olga's grave in the middle of the night and doing things. Her mother, Natalia, has been quoted saying, "You can't begin to imagine it, that somebody would touch the grave of your child, the most holy place in this world for you. We had been visiting the grave of our child for 9 years, and we had no idea it was empty. Instead, she was in this beast's apartment." So as all of this was going on and they noticed that their daughter's grave was being tampered with, she did try to tell the police, and the police were just as disgusted as she was, just as horrified as she was, but they can't really do anything. They just said to her, if you find him, do what you want to this barbarian. We won't object. Basically saying, like, if you beat him up, or if you kill him, maybe, then they'd be willing to turn a blind eye because they would agree with what she did. And Natalia says that's exactly what she would have done if she would have seen Moskvin at her daughter's grave. She would have killed him. And of course, at this point, she had no idea that her daughter had even been taken. She just thought that someone was tampering with the grave and leaving these creepy notes. She had no idea that her daughter's body was no longer in there. Now, eventually, when Natalia and her husband, Olga's father, found out what had actually happened to their daughter and all of these other girls, they couldn't actually bring themselves to look at a picture or go and see their daughter and see what this man had done to her. Natalia has seen pictures of what Moskvin has done to the other girls, and she says that that was even too much for her. She couldn't bear to see her daughter in a similar state. She's also been quoted saying, I still find it hard to grasp the scale of his sickening work, but for 9 years he was living with my mummified daughter in his bedroom. I had her for 10 years, he had her for 9. Which really puts things into perspective. You can't imagine this family's pain to know that this man has had your daughter almost as long as you got with her, but instead it's her dead body that he's dressed up to look like a doll and use as decoration. Now, their daughter's murder actually led to Olga's mother and father getting a divorce, and this was due to their different grieving methods. Olga's mother, Natalia, desperately wanted to move away from that apartment building. That was the apartment building where her daughter was killed and where her daughter's body was left behind the pipes on the roof, and where they'd lived for half a year searching for their missing daughter, not knowing that she was dead on the roof the whole time. Whereas the father saw it completely differently. He saw it as the last place he ever saw his daughter. That was the last place he ever hugged her. The last place she ever said, I love you, Dad. Like, this was such a special place to him. That was her bedroom. Nothing had changed in her bedroom since she left. And he used to go in there and sit in there for hours every single night just to feel close to her. He didn't feel as though he could give this up. He felt as though he wanted to live there forever, just to feel close to Olga. They both just had very different methods of grieving, which is fine. Everyone does. Everyone deals with loss differently. However, this is eventually what drove them apart. However, luckily, some good news for this video is that they actually found their way back together and they moved away together, and now they have another son. Natalia said that this new baby boy has restored her faith in life once again. And I know I've gone off on a bit of a tangent as I was talking about Moskvin and all of his stuff, and I've just started talking about this family, but as I was reading it, I just felt like this was the only good news that I ever really get to put in these videos, so I thought it might be nice to talk about it for once. But anyway, back to Moskvin. He was back at the station confessing to what he'd done to all of these little girls' bodies, and he was asked if he knew that what he'd done was illegal, and he said that he knew it was. He knew it was illegal, but he thought it was justified, you know, for science purposes. There's a whole quote that you can find online, but I feel like I've already read too many quotes in this video. He basically referenced some old illegal genetic studies that had gone on years ago that, yes, they were illegal, they shouldn't have happened, but they did benefit science in the long run. And he said that what he was doing was exactly the same. He knew it was illegal, but one day when we can clone and when we can bring people back to life, he is going to have benefited the world in a way. He said, from the very beginning, I knew I was committing a crime, but I felt so sorry for the children that cloning isn't available. I just wanted some material for when it is, so that these children can live for a second time. One thing that strikes me about Anatoly Moskvin is the clear lack of a motive. I mean, well, there's actually not a lack of motives. He's actually got too many motives that there's not a clear motive, you know? One minute it's for science purposes, and then the next minute it's because he feels sorry for the kids, and then the next minute it's because he's lonely. It makes it seem as though maybe he doesn't have a reason for doing what he did, and maybe his reason is just his morbid curiosity with death and the afterlife. Maybe he just wanted to dig up some bodies just to see some dead bodies and just to have them in his house. In 2013, Anatoly Moskvin confessed to 44 counts of abusing the graves and bodies of these girls, and he was charged with every single one of those. As he awaited his trial in police custody, Moskvin was given a psychiatric assessment and he was found to have paranoid schizophrenia, symptoms of which can include hallucinations and delusions. Now, it could be entirely possible, and I don't like to speculate things about people's mental health ever, or illnesses, or whatever. However, this is something that is said in this case, so I thought I would include it. It is entirely possible that all of this, sleeping on the girls' graves to communicate with their ghosts, maybe it was all a delusion. Even stemming back to his childhood, who knows how long he has been suffering with this? Maybe those dreams about Natasha Petrova, maybe those were all hallucinations or delusions. Now, Anatoly Moskvin was facing a potential 5 years in prison, which I think is kind of mad considering he literally stole children's bodies from their graves and then abused their bodies and dressed them up and kept them as decorations. I think that's maybe a couple more than 5 years. He literally destroyed these children's bodies, took all of their dignity that they had in death for his own sick benefit. Just to keep human dolls in his house. But at the end of the day, the sentence isn't that high because he didn't actually physically hurt or kill anyone. He didn't kill any of his victims, he just stole their bodies, which is a crime, and that's why he was up for 5 years. But to me, this seems like one of those crimes that maybe could progress to that level. Who knows, maybe if he wasn't caught, maybe one day robbing graves wouldn't have been enough for him. Maybe he would have wanted to get a more fresh doll. Maybe to the point where he would have committed murder himself. Who knows? So his defense team decided that it would be best if he pled insanity, which is what everyone expected, to be fair, and which is probably what should have happened because he was clearly very mentally ill. However, what happened next was rather unexpected. In court, Moskvin was asked if he had anything to say, and he turned to the families of his victims, the families of all these girls, and he dared to say, "You abandoned your girls in the cold, and I brought them home and warmed them up," insinuating that the parents were bad people for burying their dead children. It just shows you how much this guy's mental state is warped towards the whole thing. The fact that he thinks he's doing right by bringing these girls in and turning them into dolls when he's actually the one in the wrong. So the judge agreed that Anatoly Moskvin was not fit to plead guilty or not guilty in this trial due to reason of insanity. And so instead of a full trial, he was actually sent to a psychiatric hospital for indefinite holding. And in this hospital, he is to be periodically reassessed and potentially maybe one day let out if they deem his mental state to be, a lot safer. Some people think that it's very unlikely that Moskvin will ever be out of this psychiatric hospital. However, we'll carry on talking about this in a minute, but I think he could possibly be out in his lifetime, Now, some of the victims' families do not think that this punishment, this sentence of like an indefinite holding at a psychiatric hospital is enough of a punishment for what Moskvin has done to them, their families, their daughters. They think that he should be locked up in prison for a long time with other hard criminals who are going to beat and bully him and make his life hell. Some of these parents even believe that Moskvin should have been given the death sentence. I mean, whatever you personally believe about his sentencing, there's no denying that this man is severely mentally ill and should probably be under some sort of supervision and care. Going back to Olga's parents for a second and how traumatized they were not only over the murder of their daughter, but now finding out that their daughter's body has been stolen from her grave for the past 9 years, that they thought they were grieving and mourning over her. But then also the grave desecration and also the notes that kept appearing at her grave. This had been such a traumatic 10 years for that family. Of course, they had to move away from that apartment block eventually, and they went and moved somewhere else. They were going to start a new life, and it was going to be happy from then on. It was going to be peaceful. However, that poor family went from one bad situation straight into another one, because now in their new apartment they moved to a new building quite far away so that they could start this new life. But in this new apartment building, when you look out of their window, you can see the bright yellow psychiatric hospital where Anatoly Moskvin is kept. Every time they look out of the window, they have to see the building that is housing the man that did this to their daughter. They're not able to escape this, which is awful. It's rumoured that in this psychiatric hospital, Anatoly Moskvin has been repeatedly beaten. Not only by fellow patients, but also by the staff. He's also very heavily medicated. I believe he's on upwards of like 20 different medications a day, and his parents have likened him to a zombie. Every time they've gone to see him, he's just not Moskvin anymore. He has since refused to apologise to any of the parents of his victims. And to be fair, not all of them actually want an apology. Now, I don't know if this is 100% true, but I did read in a couple of sources that there was one specific father of one of the girls that has actually praised Moskvin for what he did to his daughter. He said that Moskvin has given his daughter a better life in death than he ever gave her while she was living. He said that Moskvin has cared for her and dressed her nicely and played games with her and let her watch TV, sang songs with her. He said that he was thankful for what Moskvin has done. Again, not entirely sure if that's been twisted through a source or something like that, because I don't know, I do find it kind of hard to believe, but I did it anyway. Anatoly Moskvin is now 53 years old. He is still in the psychiatric unit. However, he is actually appealing and fighting to leave and be released. And he was actually almost released in 2019. The hospital gave him the okay to leave. They thought that he was better. They thought that he was, fine to be reintegrated into real life. However, in order to have him released, they need a second opinion from someone else. Someone else came in, gave him another psychiatric assessment, and they said, hang on a minute, this man has not changed at all since his first psychiatric assessment when he came to the hospital. And so from that person's second opinion, they could no longer discharge him from the hospital, so he remained there. But how scary is that he was also almost released after 8 years? And like I said, my personal belief is that someone with behaviours like this that they don't realise are wrong, he clearly doesn't realise that what he's doing is morally horrifically wrong. He's the kind of person that could go on to do something worse if he's not properly supervised or looked after or cared for or rehabilitated in some kind of way. Whether he's given therapy or medication and he's made sure that he stays on it. I don't know. The way that he's not showing any remorse or kind of acknowledgement of how bad his actions are really worries me if he's ever let out again. Moskvin has actually somehow found a girlfriend while he was in the hospital. She's much younger than him, and he's actually now trying to get discharged so that he can go and live with her. But I mean, he's going about it completely the wrong way. He wants to get discharged, but he's showing zero remorse. And he's just kind of proving in his statements that if he was let out, he would just do the same thing completely over again. He even said, these girls are girls. There are no parents in my view. I don't know any of them. Besides, they buried their daughters, and this is where I believe their rights over them finished. So he's saying that as soon as a parent buries their child, they now have no rights over that body, and it's anyone's right to go and dig that body up. But that completes this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a big thumbs up down below because it really helps me out. Thanks again to Honey for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you want to go and download Honey, it literally only takes 2 clicks, and then you're saving money on your online shopping forever. Go to joinhoney.com/Eleanor. Make sure you put in the /Eleanor on the end so that they know that I sent you. And let's all save some money together on our online shopping. Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a big thumbs up down below. That would really help me out. If you liked this video and you want to see some more from me, make sure you subscribe using this circle right here. And if you want to subscribe to my second channel to see a different side of me, you can use this circle here. And if you want to watch another true crime video, there's a playlist on screen right now. Bye!